And since I'm the first one here up here who's not part of the book, I just also wanted to thank Steve and Tom for daring this. I don't know if the result will be tragic, but I think we have definitely succeeded in the sharing part and the community building part. And I mean, I wish the German Studies Association would have this kind of format sometimes, because it's really, it's fascinating. So Tom has volunteered to try to tell us where we are at right now.
No, that's not what I've said. We're not telling anybody where they're at. But when
it's all about Dasein.
It's about your Dasein, it's auch hier sein.
It's like Grobi in Sesamstraße. Ich will aber da sein.
Dasein heißt es bei Religious auch sehr viel. When people speak, if they would first say who they are when they speak this time, because I don't know if everybody knows everybody else, and if you don't know, it's the top line is your name, not the bottom line. Some people confuse their identity with their affiliation. So I'd like to pick up where I think Carsten said we didn't start. And I think that we actually addressed a number of the things that we wanted to address, even though it was more implicit sometimes than explicit. We did mention Max Frisch. We did sort of talk about what our Verhältnis, our relationship is to the tragic. We did talk about should we pursue unhappiness or happiness. I think we at least addressed that. I don't think that our expectation in the book or in the discussion would be that we give final answers to any of the questions. If we can maybe define some of the questions, then we have some homework to take home.
Well, we forgot to say that it's the Americans who pursue happiness and the Germans who pursue unhappiness.
Well, I don't know, since I'm representing Germany and she's living in the States, I think it's true. But there is, happiness doesn't make you more moral, according to Kant. Happiness can make you less moral. If you're doing something because you seek happiness, you could be happy but immoral, which is one reason why some people think that when we said the German tragedy, we had this joke, this running joke, would you ever do the Dutch tragedy? Well, the other thing is, some people think that German tragedy is sort of redundant. It's pleonastic, because German implies tragedy. And when you look at political happenings, you can see that some people think that. That's one of the things we should consider. That's not an answer, that's just a suggestion that we should think about it. What we noticed, Steve and I, when we're going through the volume, that there are at least two fronts. There's not a single definition, there are at least two fronts. And as people look at this, most people, even if they didn't define tragedy when they were writing about it, they had some sort of definition of background that they were using when they were writing about something else. And if we could sort of get that out, what some of these different definitions were, whether they're explicit or implicit, that would help. Most people seem to not question whether tragedy was good or bad. They sort of assume tragedy was good. And if we asked the question, do we live in tragic times? Well, I had the feeling anyway, that most of them sort of said, I certainly hope so. Which began to make no sense to me, because here I am trying to avoid things tragic from happening, and everybody that was writing this seemed to say, well, you know, let's somehow develop our capacity, our capability, our ability for the tragic. That Steve and I can discuss things like, well, are we normal human beings when we want to pursue unhappiness? Normally, healthy human beings don't pursue unhappiness, they pursue, as Carsten put it, unhappiness. I think we addressed that. We obviously didn't go into it, whether or not philologists that come to a conversation or a conference on the tragic, somehow neurotic, that's where they come, I don't know. But there may be neuroses of health, as Nietzsche said. We talked about what do we really talk about when we use the word tragic. We discovered that whether we live in tragic times or not, we live in a time where the word tragic is used quite a bit. And we discovered it's used in sort of a level of high diction and street level. We didn't really directly address the question, well, should we thank God for tragedy? I had the feeling that some people said, thank God for tragedy, which implied they were thanking, and there was tragedy, there was a God. And we had this sort of like ghosts that sort of going around the room and with Nietzsche who says that God was dead. So I don't know what happens to tragedy if God needs, if you need God to have tragedy. Felicita sort of retracted or explicated further her relationship to divinity when she said she was not using Erlösen selbst in the religious sense. I'm not sure about it, but at least that's the way I understood it. At any rate, the theology question, which is sort of the Auschwitz question, is, we was going to Auschwitz, is that a tragedy or not? I think we sort of came close to almost suggesting that question if we asked it. Is tragedy an expression of resignation in the face of the way things are, or is it a rebellion? I think there are a couple of authors that sort of said it's a mode of enlightenment, which would be sort of a political activity, enlightenment, not an aesthetic activity. Some people said that's a way of addressing political occurrences and probably changing things that aren't right. Then, I guess the question that we sort of also went around, we talked about, saving ourselves or justifying ourselves as aesthetic phenomena. That would make, are we talking about an aesthetics question or a literature question, or are we talking about something literature talks about, which is not literature? Literature that talks about itself usually doesn't circle. So I think we did actually address a number of the issues that we wanted to address. We didn't do it in a structured way in the sense that 1, 2, 3, 4, like a German lecture probably would be. So that's sort of where I think we are. And I think it probably will go back and forth in the conversation. I just hope that everybody's willing to bear with it. One way of describing, philosophically describing things that go back and forth is dialectic. So I guess we'll go dialectically back and forth. There are a lot of questions that were asked that weren't answered, but are probably sort of floating around the room. I think that some of us probably talked about them a little bit in the during the breaks. I hope that we can bring some of the conversation that we had during the break into this conversation, and hopefully we'll have enough energy after this to go into conversations during the break. This I will let Sabine comment on quickly, just because I sort of I have a feeling that when we were reading these, various attempts to get around the tragic, that some people were saying like, that's just the way it is. There is suffering, there is tragic, we can't avoid it, we should try to embrace it. And that sort of made it into an ontological category for me, or a metaphysical category. And you just accept it. It's sort of like tragedy is sort of a mystery. Then there are other people who are saying, well, tragedy is a problem which you have to address politically, philosophically in another sense. So we came to this distinction between problem and mystery, which is a distinction which probably philosophy students knew to be something that Gabriel Marcel sort of addressed way back in the period of Christian existentialism. It's also something that I think is sort of indirectly addressed in one of the essays where Kai Jaspers is referred to. So I guess I would ask you to sort of like open up the ideas as to what possibly could be understood by someone who didn't write it, with respect to, is tragedy something that is just there, like Dasein ist da und die Goethe ist genauso da wie Dasein, ich weiß es nicht. Is tragedy a category like Angst? Ist das eine Grundbefindlichkeit? Weiß es nicht. Many people, I think, addressed it in that way. We just have to recognize that it's there, and we have to integrate it into our lives, and then it will be tragic, or it will be tragic and not tragic in the sense that we use tragic like an accident or something bad, something good. I don't know if tragedy is going to be similar to something like, is that original sin for literary people? I don't know. You want to start the first question?
I think we are again in danger of confusing tragedy in the everyday sense. When we ask, is it part of the human condition, tragedy? That's one sense, we can talk about that. But this is to be distinguished from the response to that condition, the artistic, perhaps literary than tragedy in an era, in a very different sense. So it seems to me we should not confuse these, although they obviously have to do with each other, but we should be clear in which way are we using the word tragedy. So when you ask, is the human condition as such tragic, there are all sorts of platitudes that come to mind. We did not choose to live, we have to die, there's pain, and so on. All of that we can grant and don't really need to discuss, I think. That's taken for granted. There is another way in which we can talk about the tragedy of our age. We can here think, let's see, of we being the inheritors of 2 world wars, and as Germans, and the Holocaust. I remember the burning Berlin. That's part of who I am, somebody who remembers the burning Berlin in World War II. By the way, that's why I have very little sympathy with Sebald. Very little. Because I am a little older than Sebald. And he didn't experience what he's talking about. And when you follow his tracks, visit some of the places, for example, where he grew up, and then read simultaneously what he says about these places. Just look at the places and read. Well, that's a footnote which I probably shouldn't have. But, but I think that we can talk then still about tragedy in that first sense, that as heirs of a history, and here, of course, the German situation becomes special. We are the heirs of 2 world wars, of the Holocaust, in a sense which does speak of, invites talk about our condition as being burdened, certainly, by that past, in this sense, tragic. And then the question is how to respond to that here. That's a different question here. But on the first level, we should distinguish between the everyday sense in which we say human existence is indeed tragic. I find that very uninteresting. We are only going to get trivialities here.
I have to, can I respond to you quickly? Because I'm disappointed because I wasn't sure if you were writing about trivialities in your text, because is Heidegger referring to tragedy in its absence, of course? Is he referring to that in a literary way, or on what level did Heidegger refer to it?
Heidegger is invoking, I think, as I tried to argue in that article, Greek tragedy. He wants basically, at that point in the 30s, a repetition of Greek tragedy in a totally modern key. So it's not, doesn't mean getting back Greek tragedy. But in his case, the whole discussion is burdened by the expectation of Erlösung, redemption. He is never, I would argue, able to cast away his Catholic past, although he no longer believes in God. A framework has survived where you have to reoccupy positions which that past gave him. And redemption is one of these. And therefore, that Spiegelgespräch in the end, only a God can save us. That is all too Heideggerian. I think it follows from his whole trajectory. And I want to take exception here. I want to say, be very understanding of Eigentlichkeit in Heidegger, authenticity, and that burdens a little bit this discussion even when it doesn't invoke Heidegger. We somehow want to be authentic. I think we should take a very careful look at that demand for authenticity, a questioning look. It burdens, first of all, is a category which insists on the isolated individual, who basically has, for the time being at least, turned his or her back on society. It's an apolitical, in this sense, category. Has to be sure to find his or her way back to the social need. But it is a notion that I think we have to question. Is authenticity to be given the normative way, which Heidegger, despite certain denials, does give it? And I want to question that. I think it's important to realize that death is not worth spending as much time thinking about, at least my death, especially when you get older. I think death is not the most important thing. We will all die, we know that. But I think death causes a blindness. We should realize that there are other things which, including the relationship to others, that are much more important here, that openness to the other. And authenticity stands in the way of that. Yeah. So I think that, yes, Heidegger talks about the human condition and takes a tragic gives a tragic interpretation, and tragic in the sense not of being indebted to his understanding, I think a mistaken understanding of Greek tragedy. But that's certainly the case.
I just want to say that people might help each other by saying your name when you first speak, Carsten Harris. And I want to bring people in who haven't had a chance before. So John.
I'm John Murray. And I had a conversation this summer with David Bromwich, who took the term tragic to extreme task as a term we use, particularly when we refer to it under political circumstances. This is a tragic choice. And he treated it as a kind of phrase you invoke when you wish to duck responsibility for something that you realize you ought to take responsibility for. I think he was particularly beating up on Niebuhr when he said that, which kind of shocked me, because Niebuhr is sort of a hero to me. But I think that the important thing that I would want to say in reply to Bromwich's critique, that tragedy is an easy thing to say about something bad you've done that you don't feel you had a choice to do. I guess he also has in mind Captain Vere from Billy Budd, as somebody he's beating up on in that claim, is to remember that the hallmark of tragedy is a certain kind of tragic knowledge. And that tragic knowledge involves persisting in the face of something horrible without theodicy. I think that tragedy and theodicy are opposites, and it's a mistake to think of tragedy, to think of tragic knowledge as a form of theodicy. When tragedy offers catharsis through pity and terror, I don't think it offers to explain suffering. I think that what it's simply trying to offer is a shared experience of courage in the face of that suffering, which is why I think it's something that you do with an audience. Yeah. And I also want to pick up the thread of why I think there is something about democracy in tragedy, because one of the things that gives you the experience of tragedy is the experience of having to manage a contradiction you're never going to solve. I mean, that's our understanding of tragedy back to Hegel's day. And if you ask what you know when you know tragic knowledge, what you know is that you're not going to know. Whatever tragic knowledge is, it is something you do in the face of what you're never going to know. One of the things you know is that the things you do to avoid suffering are likely created. That's what happens to Oedipus after all. Or that the things you do because you think they're right are going to cause wrong to proliferate. That's what happens to Orestes. I mean, I think that the big lessons of tragedy are a certain kind of ability to stand up in the face of a modest recognition that your reason is limited and your agency is limited, but your responsibility is not so limited.
Jeffrey Bernstein, I'd like to draw on what you, Carsten, and Thomas have said, specifically Thomas about where tragedy deals with life and not literature. What I'm here, I would like to suggest, because I don't want to provide a final answer, but I would like to suggest that tragedy doesn't refer to literature, but it is a literary genre or form which refers to precisely what literature talks about, life. It seems to me that's what you were getting at in making the distinction between life and the presentation. In that sense, there isn't a theodicy in tragedy. If tragedy is understood in its ancient Greek sense, to speak very simplistically for a moment, then it precisely becomes something that educates, something that people who are watching and seeing, but not immediately involved in it, can work through. All right, I'll just go there. The big problem for me with German idealism and the German notions of the tragic has always been that it replaces the seeing with being involved in a historical moment of existence whereby tragedy becomes an existential structure of how we live our life. That to me is problematic because it runs the risk of certain things, like certainly the aestheticization of life, all of those problems, judging life according to the good and the ugly. But it also confuses precisely what I think Carsten was getting at, which is that suffering isn't tragic in the sense that suffering is, homicide, or I'll go there again. I don't think the Holocaust was tragic. It was horrific. There can be tragic portrayals of the Holocaust. That would be something that we see, something that we hear, something that we're confronted with to work through. I'm not sure that Primo Levi or Jean Améry's life was tragic. It was horrific. It led to their suicide. But I think that addressing the problems, your name one more time, I'm forgetting. John, just to bring them together, I think there is a way to deal with Tom's concern about not having this become too abstract and mediated and, if you will, dry and academic, but at the same time, not confusing the suffering in real life with the portrayal of it, which is always meant, if not to heal, then at least to educate.
I'm Jim McFarland. I think this is very interesting, and but I also want to suggest that there may be a danger in situating tragedy in the collective context, and I warn against that. This is something that I think Walter Benjamin was concerned with, that there's a notion that's in the background that can become quite destructive, which is the notion of sacrifice. That then the death of the tragic hero is redeemed, so to speak, for us. And we notice that when there are these catastrophes, one of the political ways that the notion is justified is to start calling it a tragedy in the sense that the loss of all of these people on 9/11 or whatever it might be, this goes to the designation of Holocaust versus Shoah, for instance. The leeriness that some have expressed about referring to that event as a Holocaust, in the sense that that gives it this sacrificial dimension that somehow seems like too easy a redemption. And certainly writing in the wake of the First World War, or of the outbreak of the First World War, where a language of tragedies is being mobilized to justify a great deal of violence and destruction, this idea that these people are dying for us, and that we reconstitute ourselves as a community around their loss, seems to me to have a lot of dangerous implications. That I take your point very, very seriously. That I think the question of authenticity is a very dangerous one as well. This idea of I gain a tragic knowledge, but if we listen to Voltaire, then the tragic knowledge is always going to be displaced from the person who does the dying to those of us who then survive that. And if we then start, that would create a situation in which the violence is being justified in those terms. So I just put that out there as the dialectical danger on the other side, collectivizing it too much.
Ja, ich möchte nach dem Vorhergesagten vorschlagen, dass wir das Adjektiv tragisch von der Gattungsbezeichnung der Tragödie trennen. Ich glaube, das ist wirklich sehr, sehr wichtig. Für das Adjektiv tragisch, also wenn wir irgendein Ereignis mit diesem Epitheton, mit diesem Adjektiv bezeichnen, da gehen, glaube ich, ganz viele von diesen Vorstellungen einher, die Sie eben benannt haben, ja, die Rechtfertigung des Opfers, die Verklärung des Schicksals, etwas Schlimmes ist irgendwie gerechtfertigt, weil es so hat sein müssen, ja, weil irgendwie eine Art von Schicksal, das dahinter steht, das wir nicht verstehen, das es aber in irgendeiner Weise akzeptierbar für uns macht, das Ereignis rechtfertigt. Ich glaube aber, dass die Tragödie als literarische Gattung in gewisser Weise sogar einen Gegensatz dazu darstellt. Ich glaube, in der Tragödie geht es nicht um den Pursuit of Unhappiness. Ich glaube, die Tragödie, die griechische Tragödie, die shakespearische Tragödie, viele andere authentische Tragödien sind eigentlich Handlungsanalysen. Es sind Versuche, Handlungen so genau zu analysieren, dass der Punkt, an dem das tragische Selbstzerstörungsbedürfnis, die Rechtfertigung des Opfers, an dem das Schicksal ausgelöst wird, dass diese Punkte hervortreten, dass diese Punkte isoliert werden. Und dass es letztlich um die Frage geht, das Ziel der Tragödie ist die Frage, wie lässt sich die Tragödie vermeiden? Ich glaube, also nicht das Wort ist tragisch, sondern der Tragödien, wie sie aufgeführt wurden. Es gibt sozusagen eine Frage, gibt es irgendeine Möglichkeit, diesen durch menschlichen durch menschliches Handeln ausgelöstem Schicksal zu entkommen, zu entrinnen. Deswegen kann man sagen, in dem Adjektiv tragisch drückt sich tatsächlich the pursuit of unhappiness aus. Aber in der Form der Tragödie, also wirklich in der durchgearbeiteten literarischen Form der Tragödie, da drückt sich etwas anderes aus. Ich glaube, the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, I just want to sort of quickly summarize without repeating what you said, that if we decide and agree that we separate the tragic from tragödie, from tragedy as a form, that fits nicely with what Jennifer said this morning, that she hopes we live in a time of tragedy, and that fits nicely with what Tom wrote at the end of the book, when he says the tragic author does not write as if reporting historical facts, he writes critically questioning the facts to discover their philosophical meaning and ethical consequence for the future.
Thank you. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's precisely what I think you were trying to say. Yeah.
Directly to that point, I'm Gesa Fleming from Wellesley College. Well, I was going to ask you for your name. So I'm very much in favor of the distinction you make, partly because I think it allows the following move. Maybe it would make sense to say every tragedy, every work of art that deserves that name, or is an interpretation of what we could consider as truly tragic. And I'm saying that coming from my experience with Wagner, and from my experience, for example, with operas like Tannhäuser and Hollander, where female self-sacrifice, in my opinion, is glorified as something truly tragic and truly redemptive. So I don't think that every tragedy invites us to think about, so there's some, I think that we must make a distinction between tragedies that invite us to think about ways out of the situation, but also other artworks that invite us to empathize and glorify things that, say, you could also call erotic, outrageous, socially produced, but the artwork, that's me as a critic saying, wow, this is ideological. But that's not in tragedy, so I'm in favor of the distinction, but would like to argue against it.
Only one remark. I think in this respect, we should talk about tragedy normative and not only in a descriptive way.
I've just got a question. I think you used the word truly tragic, and you said you used the word redemptive.
Yeah.
What did it mean?
In what I said, in Wagner, for example, the big conflict in Hollander is this suffering captain who roams the seas, and there's this beautiful young woman who has this neurotic obsession with him, and in the end, to redeem him, she kills herself, which is the high point of the whole opera, and I don't see anything in the music or in the plot that would say, whoa, this is not good. She is not even something that, there are indications to say this is pathological. Feminist readings have now come to read this as an obsession and come to read this whole, so I saw a recent staging at the Boston Lyric Opera which explained this as, in terms of modern psychiatry, why she's doing it, which I think is a way to resist the pull of the music that wants to invite us into taking pleasure in the deliberate female self-sacrifice for the redemption of the male artist. So what I'm saying is, and this is the critical work of performance that shows this, but is it the form of Wagner's music? I don't see that it invites us to think against it. It's more an affirmation of a myth, and it's a way to be a feminine hero, which brings me, I have this general problem with the category of the, well, I like the category on one hand. On the other hand, I think it is really intricately tied to notions of greatness that are highly gendered. And there are only very limited ways in which female greatness can be defined in that symbolic tradition.
Yeah, I guess I asked an unloaded question, but it was a loaded answer.
Yes.
In the sense that all I wanted to do was, like, I heard the word redemption, which was a word that we use quite a bit this morning, and I wanted to find out if this word gets sort of reactivated for our conversation now. I don't know who else is going to.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, of course, one of the things that you notice when you read the articles is that the women corpses are piling up, right, in the course of the articles. And my question with that was, well, if tragedy is illumination, but also pleasure, whose pleasure are we talking about, you know?
This picks up a point that Wolfgang was also commenting on, and we talked about this morning, and then also sparked by, Gisela, Giza. So picking up on both of the points and then a bit echoing some of our discussions, and also I think Karsten's comment as well is embedded in this. One of the advantages of maintaining this distinction, as Wolfgang was suggesting, between the tragische and Tragödie, the tragic and the tragedy, and maintaining the sense that tragedy has, if not only a standard art form, is a form of representation of some kind, is that it also makes room, and here's Giza's point, it makes room for critical distance from that representation. Whereas if we collapse the two, which is very easy to do because of the Umgangssprache and the everyday, if we collapse the two, it's very difficult to pull yourself out of the implications of the everyday use of tragedy in order to have that critical distance. You can't criticize the tragic in that liberally used sense of the word that doesn't imply a representation of suffering. You can't criticize suffering. You can criticize a representation of suffering because of what it may imply, what it may expect of you, what it may presuppose. And you can also appreciate what it may presuppose and so forth and so on. So that sort of critical distance is also affirmed by keeping those two conceptually distinct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were other people lined up. Okay, Carsten and Joe, and then Steve also, and yes, Klaus.
I want to pick up on the last three questions, especially Wolfgang's, I think when we talk about tragedy, I accept the, I don't want to talk about the need to distinguish, that's taken for granted, I think. But when we talk about tragedy, our understanding of tragedy will differ a great deal depending on a background understanding of the relationship of reality to either God or reason or nothing really. That is to say, if we believe that there is an omnipotent good deity presiding over reality, then in a deep sense, there is no tragedy. In a deep sense, there can be no tragedy. If we think that reality and reason are somehow in mesh, then we arrive at something like the Hegelian position, which is very close to the one that you put forward in your article, actually. To that, we can oppose, however, something like a Schopenhauerian position, where basically history has no more significance than a bunch of cats and dogs fighting, as Schopenhauer says in one place. If we have that view of history, then that sense of tragedy doesn't make any sense. Then we get tragedy as an invitation to renunciation. Basically, this amounts to a turn to the aesthetic. We turn the tragedy into an aesthetic object, basically. Now, I think different from all of these, I think all of these are basically post-Greek understood. I don't think we can assemble the Hegelian to the Greek position. I think the Greeks did not place that demand on reality, that it be presided over by God or by reason, or then we get nothing, This is not the way they thought about reality. So I see Greek understanding as life-affirming. And there is no deep reason, like God or so, no absolute, that sanctions that life affirmation. It doesn't need that kind of affirmation. It justifies itself. So I think it recalls us to, if you read Escher's Prometheus, which I use in that Heidegger essay, interestingly enough here, and that worked well against Heidegger, he says, when he prides himself of what he has given humanity, he has freed humanity from having to think about death. That's a very important statement. That is, it's precisely in a way he says he has allowed the Greeks to be superficial, in one sense.
Jesus.
And Nietzsche, of course, will pick up on that. That is, the Greeks were profound because of their superficiality. And I think that's what tragedy, in a sense, has to teach us. That is, the profundity of tragedy, in part, lies with its superficiality. And I think being heirs to a Christian and a post-Christian way of thinking about tragedy, we find it very hard to accept that. Yeah. But I think that's really what tragedy has to contribute.
I'm Joe Lawrence, and I want to agree and disagree with Karsten. And what I certainly share with him is a sense of the profoundly life-affirming moment in Greek tragedy. And where I disagree is I think that life affirmation, if it's life affirmation, is necessarily bound together with the courage to look death in its face, and that it's clear that there are things wrong with Heidegger's analysis. It's not really the case that you can't be with someone in their dying. There's more potential for community there than Heidegger lets on. But even if you take it in Heideggerian terms, that the moment when we face our death is, the moment that totally individuates us and separates us and so forth and so on, I think one has to understand that as the condition of the possibility of honest communication. That is to say, we can communicate with one another superficially when we look away from the painful, we look away from our own fragility, we look away from our own finitude. At that point, we lose ourselves in chatter. If we want to communicate with ourselves in a profound and significant way, then we have to communicate out of our aloneness. And there's a paradox here, that in that moment of aloneness is that's where we're most deeply bound together, because this is what makes us human. And it seems to me to make that move that oh my gosh, you're not supposed to be obsessed with death or look at it or whatever. I think it's a dangerous move, because then your life affirmation is going to be, as you said, superficial. And when I want to affirm life, I want to affirm life all the way down to my last breath.
But one thing I'd question in this rhetoric in Heidegger, and also in your comment, is this notion of fleeing from. I think, of course, I agree with you, we have to affirm death. But what does that mean? When I, for example, imagine somebody who plays a string quartet, say, gets totally absorbed in what is to be produced. That is a self-forgetting. He loses himself to the performance. When I love someone, in a way I lose myself. And I think the greatest moments of life of that sort, Heidegger has difficulty with those. It's not that, I think the very rhetoric that inauthenticity means always a fleeing from is a seductive but false rhetoric. It doesn't need to be a fleeing from. It means that life is worth living in a way in which dwelling on death is not worth thinking about. This doesn't mean that we don't confront death. We know that we're going to die and so on. I know that sooner or later, not so late, probably only a few years, I'm going to die. Does it weigh on me? Do I think I should think? No, not at all. So I think there are many things in life that are worth, not because I flee from death, but because the things that life has to offer are valuable enough to merit my wholehearted engagement.
I want to go ahead. I'm skipping you for now because you already have a chance and you haven't had much
Thank you.
chance.
I'm Josh Billings. I wanted to, I guess, go back to the distinction Wolfram made between tragedy and tragic, and then the distinctions that Karsten brought up about the different regimes of tragedy, which I think is really important. I think Benjamin is, to go back to Jim's comment in the paper, Benjamin is the person who's thought this problem most consequential. I don't think he particularly came up with the right answer, but he's actually done the most, he's made the the most serious attempt to understand different forms of tragedy as emanations of different societies and different worldviews. And that, I think, is something that is essential to our understanding of what tragedy as a literary form is. That is that historical differentiation. It doesn't make sense to me to talk about Greek tragedy and Shakespearean tragedy as giving the same understanding of the relation of life and literature. And then I think we can also think about different regimes of the tragic. That is, the kind of tragic that Hegel gives us and the kind of tragic that Nietzsche gives us, I think are quite different. I mean, I think they're importantly similar, they're importantly in the same tradition, but I'm, I suppose, acting the crude historicist when I say that there are contexts that I would want to build around all of these terms, and those contexts, I think, have to be in the first instance historical, and to me that's the basis for a discussion.
That helps, sorry. There were two more hands, yes, Klaus, and then you go ahead.
I would like to disagree with a couple of contentions. First, the one with the tragic and dissociating it from the genre of tragedy, because I think that specificity of the genre, which is more than a genre, it's a form of life at a particular instance, allows us to profane and destroy, I would say, permanently, the idea of a tragic in universal terms. And I think of Hölderlin, certainly Benjamin as well, who says if we forget the Greek notion of tragedy, really as genre and as form of life, we're doomed. Either we're becoming sclerotic or we're becoming excessive. And that is because he always links the tragic back to the form, genre, and form of life that tragedy meant. So I would think that a distinction is possible, but not a disassociation or separation. And that brings me just to the second point that I would like to make. I think there's nothing more uncertain for tragedy than death. And I think the articles in the book have actually, mostly at least, carried with that. Because, I mean, think of, whether side, like the essay on Faust, the wish of the unborn to never be born. Or, of course, right, Wolfram has that nice point that, you know, tragedy in Aristotle is wedded to a sort of form to our life cycle. But that life cycle, that frame, is completely in shambles when you consider tragedy. Oedipus, clearly, but also when you consider then the idea of tragedy when we get into the 19th and 20th century, where it's the question of the afterlife of tragedy and the death of tragedy in its afterlife. For example, Hannah Arendt, the death of immortality, or Adorno, the death of immortality. That pushes against the idea of a death that could be a closure or a limit. The death drive in Freud has at least 3 versions that are not just death as a limit. It's actually more about immortality than about the limit death. And I mean, thinking about the nicht sterben können that was inflicted on the Auschwitz victims, the deprivation of death in that Adorno or Levinas discussed. Those are all sort of wedded to the idea of the tragic in its afterlife, in that what migrates into the life of the corpse, so to say. Sorry.
So just to ask a question that connects it back to the Holocaust references before. So could you then say that the Holocaust is not tragic when looked at from the Jewish perspective, but it is tragic when looked at from the German perspective because it is a self-destruction open-eyed self-destruction?
That's Jakob Taubes' point.
Yeah. Is that possible?
I have no ready answer for that. What I would say though is that what is the most poignant experience in Levi and Levinas is that to be denied the status of sacrifice, to be denied the status of dying, of being capable of dying. And in that sense, it is something that tragedy both seems to defy. There is a certain limit and closure and immortality to the tragic, but it seems at the same time that tragedy thematizes that crisis of the moment of death, where, like Oedipus of Colonus, where it's more about the afterlife of the tragic hero. So I think that the Oedipus of Colonus would speak most that moment where the limit of immortality dissolves.
Yeah. I'm just grappling with this because of the element of beauty involved, right, and the pleasure. And that's what, I mean, Adorno, I think, grappled with when he talked about poetry after Auschwitz. But then we have a lot of tragic literature after Auschwitz now that is in some sense beautiful, right, in its ugliness. So yeah, maybe we need a political scientist to solve that.
Mark Tiro, actually, I think that,
too political.
Klaus really set me up very well, so thank you. Because, I mean, Hannah Arendt and the Holocaust and Oedipus Colonus, because if you look at On Revolution, which is the 1963 book that Arendt published on revolutions, she ends it with an extended verse citation of Oedipus Colonus, not only in English, but in the original German, Greek script. And I think that what's interesting about that book is that when people think of tragedy, thinking of the Holocaust and World War II, but I think Arendt would say, especially in On Revolution, when she thinks of tragedy, she thinks of the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the partisan resistance against the Nazis, and it's really all about agency. And this gets back to the whole question of democracy and tragedy. I think that, I think that for Arendt, it's very much wrapped into this notion that tragedy is about, not about suffering, but about missed opportunities, about the aspiration for something great or good that fails, the aspiration for being in a free polity, the aspiration to be in a society where you settle things by discussion, debate, rather than by guns. And so when I hear the word, so for me, tragedy and tragic, when I hear those words, I hear the aspiration for freedom, for democracy. And that's why one thing that bothers me is this dismissal of ordinary language uses. Because I think it's typical of, now I'm going to get myself in trouble, I think it's typical of literature professors to dismiss everyday language, ordinary language uses of tragedy. But Arendt would say, I think, she would say that if you listen closely to those ordinary language uses, what you might hear is somewhere very deep an aspiration for agency, an aspiration for solidarity, an aspiration for identity that the Greeks worked on through their tragedy, and that we, because we're so remote from participatory democracy, we can only express it in this language that seems so superficial, but actually might be, sort of activating those desires to be a free agent, to be a democratic citizen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Charlie, and actually, you. Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
I'm Charles Mayer.
And then.
I don't have the command over these authors, but one thing, one quote comes to mind which hasn't come up, and then I have questions. From Hamlet, I forget. We are to the gods like flies to wanton boys. They kill us for their sport. That's not a tragic condition, particularly. That's almost a type of destructiveness in the sense of things, and that's why I'm not sure that death and affirmation of death as part of life doesn't resonate particularly to me. There's too much death that's wanton sport, and so I'd like some thought on whether that attitude is that analysis is compatible with what people are talking about as tragedy. It does seem to me the tragic such that separation is, of course, I think, fundamentally good. We recognize the tragic as something that could have been differently, lives cut short, people's cut short, that there was a potential for more love, which has been taken away. It seems to me, though, that tragedy as such introduces a concept, not, I don't know if you thought, of responsibility. This is what's so, what I find, that's why these tragedies are intensely political. And I think politics, and not just democratic politics, this is chorus and people looking at spectators, but politics as such need choice, responsibility. This I think is a dimension that absolutely is essential to tragedy as representation of the work of art.
I agree with this question, this Charlie raises about the political nature of it. And I think that one way to get at this is to come back to what Giza said, and this is to ask who is capable of tragic and who is sacrificed within tragedies. And here the question of women is really central to the big tradition. I mean, you think about Kleist and Tisnelda being torn apart. I mean, that's, but also, I mean, very classically, is Gretchen a classic figure within, especially Wolf Faust and Faust I? I mean, this is something I'm a historian, so when I started writing about Faust, it was with a lot of compunction. But may I do this? And one of the big things that I couldn't figure out in the literature was, am I allowed to even say that Gretchen is a tragic figure? Because it seemed like, again, this we were divided about. So, but let me give you one other, in a way, almost not more problematic, but maybe more divisive place where, in German history, that became a really big issue. And this was in the midst of the Historiker Strike. There was a historian, Andreas Hildenburg, who wrote a book. Now, it was not called Zweierlei Tragödie, it was called Zweierlei Untergang. But essentially the rhetoric of tragedy was behind these two kinds, and one was about the German Wehrmacht, ordinary soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front, and actually his publisher paired it with the Holocaust. And so there was a case where huge politics was written all over, and I think would still divide up this room over the question of who and in what context can one even begin to talk about tragedy.
And the discussion about unsere Väter, unsere Mütter kind of connects to that very much, right? And very strong feelings on all sides. I think
I wanted to pick up a theme that
Gene.
Robert, was Gene.
No, I didn't see him. He's in my blind spot.
That Robert had mentioned, and I think it was his quotation from Arendt's On Revolution set me off. If we think of tragedy in terms of sacrifice and death, I think as you were in the Wagnerian operas, we get one picture of tragedy that is easy to keep at arm's length, because we can see in ways that use is discreditable. But I think that Carsten is probably right that the key experience around which even tragedy centers isn't death, but is the feeling that for one reason or another that you didn't anticipate, you have done something that morally discredits you. And I think the paradigm, I mean, that's certainly the case with Orestes, that's certainly, I'm an Americanist, so when I think tragedy, I think Hawthorne. And that is, of course, the experience of every character in Hawthorne, that those characters only become individuated under circumstances where they have recognized that they have already somehow discredited themselves. And they have to find some way to maintain themselves in the face of their knowledge that they've discredited themselves. They never do an especially good job in Hawthorne. Hawthorne never ever lets his characters off the hook. But he also judges characters very harshly who despair of other characters ever getting off the hook either. And it strikes me that the tragic consciousness that you get out of a figure like Hawthorne, and to a lesser extent Melville, is the ability to place yourself in the situation of somebody who will always have dirty hands. And that the experience of tragic consciousness for them is the experience of trying to live past the experience of the recognition of having dirty hands.
I like that. Jean, do you? Oh.
I would like to go back to what you said, Rob. You quoted the end of On Revolution, and there is this quote in Greek, and it's from the second edition. And the word tragedy does not pop up in this context. It's just a quote from a text, and we know that's a tragedy. But the word tragedy is kind of running through the book, and it's never connected to tragedy. It seems to kind of move in a field where the concept of tragedy and the history of thinking about concepts of tragedy seem to kind of clash into something that is not yet a concept. And I think this is very interesting because it poses a question, and I guess it's connected to your reading of Heidegger. And I can't do that now. What I might be able to do is give a couple of hints. So there is the history of the tragedy, and there's the history of reflections on the tragedy, which is not the same, of course. And then there is a kind of a rupture in history, and then there's a confrontation with historical constellations for which those who think about this constellation do not yet have a concept. And in this open question, this kind of burning open question, this is the series of failed revolutions in the 20th century, it's the series of absolutely destructive wars without any prejudice, all of a sudden this word pops up. And it's not naive, because it's used by people who know exactly what the tradition of this word and this concept means. So it shows up, and it kind of carries the weight of this tradition together with it. It's kind of connected to the weight of the tradition, but it points to something that does not have a name yet. And that's I think, it's interesting if you think about the kind of, let's call it, the political implications of this word tragedy.
Yes, sure.
I mean, one way to respond to this, she says the French Revolution is a tragedy. We can always think, okay, the terror, but she also calls the American Revolution a tragedy. And she actually uses the word tragic. And she does. Why? I mean, she does because we missed an opportunity. That the United States, we didn't sort of institutionalize spaces where people could act in a participatory way on the local level. And so I think what ties all those notions of tragedy, the uses of ordinary language tragedy, and also this evocation of Greek tragedy is this idea of democratic agency. That is the sort of the lost treasure, she calls it in the last chapter. And that's why, once again, when I hear tragedy, I don't think of Holocaust or war and suffering. I think of these failures of revolutions. I mean, I'm sort of following Arendt there. But I also find interesting that in 1963, she also published Eichmann in Jerusalem. And in her post-war writing, she never uses the word tragic and tragedy when she talks about the Holocaust. No. But in Eichmann, she brings tragedy back, and I think she brings tragedy back because she figured out that this is what's viable for me, is that tragedy is about the loss of democratic agency, the missed opportunity.
Just as a quick footnote, one of the interesting and perhaps paradoxical things about Arendt is that from the standpoint of Judaism, it's precisely the history of German-Jewish relations prior to the Shoah, and it's everything surrounding the state of Israel up until the Six-Day War that's tragic. The Shoah is not tragic, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned.
The founding of Israel, that's very key too, because that's the founding of a polity.
Yeah.
People could act.
Yeah.
I just want to make a comment. I think I'm watching the ball move, the ball event, and the ball seems to be moving from an aesthetic, metaphysical type of framework. We don't know the name of the thing that we're looking for, but we seem to be finding the place that we're looking, right? And we're moving it into from away from the aesthetics, metaphysical, mystery type of thing to a political, ethical question, which keeps to come up with, especially what you say, Rob, and what you were saying too. That it's like, where do we start looking for a possible answer to this question? I'm just finding like the way we're phrasing the question right now, we're phrasing it more and more as a political, ethical question and a literature question, aesthetics question, right? So I don't know, I think...
So then the simple question would be, is tragedy still possible today? In a time where we are literally doomed?
Well, if I listen to the people that are trying to describe the political context of the question, I wouldn't be able to ask that question, right? I wouldn't use the word doom, I would use the word responsibility, which includes the possibility, or at least includes the possibility of possibly avoiding doom, right? Or making use of the chance that we could have, right?
Well, Arab Spring, I'll just respond to that. Arab Spring, that tragedies, you know, as long as people are aspiring and trying to gain democratic agency, aren't to say it's not tragic.
Yes.
I just wanted to make a short remark. I mean, literary questions are ethical questions as well. I mean, they're crucial ethical questions, and I think James brought it up because we're talking about, I mean, who is in charge? Who tells the story? Talk about the sacrifice, or even in the Wagnerian thing, you find the ethical question, of course, because who is in charge? Who has the means to tell stories in front of an audience? And this is not a feminist question, but this is a very, very general question. You brought it up too. So if Adorno comes into play, you know, what do you do? What about literature after the Holocaust? Yesterday I talked about that. So the problem is about, you know, it's all about stealing. It's about taking other people's stories and retell them, you know, and people even feel good about it. And not to talk about this huge amount of kitsch that is, you know, that is circulating and is selling as tragedy. So this is an ethical question, and a question about marketing too. And I think this is a very, very interesting and concrete thing, and this is what very many writers do not talk about, and they try to avoid that. And this is also where Sebald comes into play, and it's a very interesting point, I think.
We will take one more question, and then do we have another coffee break, or do we immediately have the next session?
I think we probably...
We should break it in any case.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't you...
Okay.
You had the last word last time, so you
yeah,
go.
right. I'll take us back to one of the early comments. You asked just a few minutes ago, is tragedy possible today? And I wanted to point out a paradox that one of the earliest comments made, a very intelligent comment by John, was that tragedy is not possible together with a theodicy. So it is certainly ironic that we live probably in one of the least religious ages of all time, but the suggestion is tragedy is only possible in an age without God. But we seem to not be able to find tragedy in our age, an age that is merely godless, and say it's not possible in an age with God. I would challenge both claims in a sense. I think there are certainly times when tragedy will be more present than in others for any number of reasons, having perhaps to do with contradictions in society, the way individuals react to them, concepts of responsibility, etc. But I don't think it is fair to say that if you have a concept of God, tragedy is not possible. Let me give you 3 quick examples. One is, even if we accept an idea of God, that there is an infinite reason, our reason is finite. And we will often make decisions. Wolfram rightly points out that zu spät kommen, that plays a role often in tragedy. That we may make a decision, that had we had infinite time, we would have figured it out, but we make a decision thinking it's right, but it has hard consequences. An example would be a nice radio play by Joachim Maas called The Ice of Cape Sabine. There is a polar expedition, and the captain decides, against the protest of the other survivors, that he must kill one of the persons, a person whom the others don't know actually saved the captain's life, and a person whom the captain secretly pardoned once before, but when he finds him stealing food from a sick person, he says, it is my obligation to take his life. And he does so, and shortly thereafter they're saved. Had it happened a little bit earlier that they were saved, that would not have been necessary. The rules of engagement would have been radically different. Whether you have a concept of God or not, this is a tragic situation. He's guilty, but he also had to do it in a sense. But he's working within a frame of human time that is limited. The second example would actually be from a play that was mentioned several times during this discussion, Oedipus at Colonus. The choral ode that is cited by, I think, 3 or 4 people in the volume, where the chorus says, the best is not to have been born, the second best is to die as quickly as possible. This is said by the chorus, which is really quite mediocre in the play, and misjudges Oedipus completely. And it's a quote itself. You find it in Theognis, Herodotus, Euripides, and it's overcome in the course of the play. They lament the old age, loneliness of old age, but Oedipus in this play develops a friendship with Theseus. She has the loving relationship with Antigone, and then she is invited to be, he's invited to become really one of the gods. And we want to say Sophocles did not have a tragic consciousness because he saw this possibility of union with the gods. I'm not so sure. And the last example is from Hans Jonas, who has a nice essay called The Concept of God After Auschwitz. It depends on your concept of God whether tragedy is possible. He says that God is all good, but that God is not all powerful, that God restricted his power in order to give humans freedom. If you have a concept of human freedom, still with a concept of God, tragedy is possible.
My question, I asked the question as an environmentalist because I'm really concerned with people going from denial to despair, and that there's a very interesting move towards spirituality and religion in the environmental movement, and at the same time the desperate need for the kind of art that will wake people up to their responsibilities. So yeah, I like your answer. Anyway, we have time for coffee, more coffee, so we can keep talking. Thank you.